Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. It's a new year, but we're going to hear some familiar voices. For instance, Noah Gould joins us. He is a Young Voices contributor. And Noah, I know you wear a few other hats as well. Take just a moment to tell us just a little bit about yourself. Then we have some fun stuff to discuss.
Yeah, well, Brian, thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure. I work at the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty, where I run our student programs, and then I write on a variety of topics: economics, culture, current events.
And I'm looking at an article that you wrote for the dailyeconomy.org about how the Department of Justice's antitrust case against Spirit Airlines has made the strongest airlines stronger. Now, I have to admit, when I hear Spirit Airlines, there's some kind of a joke there, like, oh, yes, the Greyhound of the skies. But talk to me about, I understand they entered bankruptcy proceedings, or at least they announced they were going to enter bankruptcy proceedings. What's the story behind what's been going on at Spirit?
Yeah, so the jokes are endless about, after taking a Spirit ride, your spirit is all that's left or whatever. But really, they play a really important role in the economy for flights. If you think about different consumers have different preferences for whether they want something all-inclusive, like, Delta is probably the closest to that product offering, or whether they want something much more piecemeal. And that's what Spirit and other budget airlines offer. And so what the Department of Justice was trying to do with this lawsuit, and what they claimed was the goal, was to make airfare cheaper, make more consumer choices. There's a lot in the air kind of about antitrust and conversations about, are different companies too big? So this was a case where the Department of Justice blocked the merger between JetBlue and Spirit Airlines. So the two airlines wanted to combine to become kind of a stronger budget airline to compete with the big other larger airlines. But the Department of Justice blocked that merger. And so what my article really covers, and I think what's really interesting, is what happened after they blocked that merger, and are consumers better off or not? Because now we can look at some of the fallout from that decision.
Yeah, that's the first question that comes to mind for me is, okay, so how is this protecting or helping the public for the Justice Department to block that merger? What was their reasoning?
Yeah, so they said that Spirit Airlines and JetBlue had some overlapping routes that they run. And so if they merged, there wouldn't be competition on those specific routes. And so basically they said, okay, there will be higher prices, less options for consumers. So that's why we're going to block that merger. Now, what we've seen actually happen is very different than what the Department of Justice and a few states that joined the lawsuit predicted.
Well, yeah, by filing bankruptcy, I mean, now they're still running into, there's some lack of competition if one of these airlines ends up, bowing out of it altogether. Now, you actually addressed this question, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it. Who benefits when a merger like this is blocked?
So what's now apparent is that it's the big four airlines. So it's Delta, it's American, it's Southwest, and the other large airlines benefit. And the reason this is because Spirit, after the merger talks were blocked, Spirit exited those talks in a very weakened position. They really weren't as strong as the Department of Justice made them to seem in this lawsuit. And so Spirit has now filed for bankruptcy. It's a first bankruptcy proceeding, so it means that they still could come out as a operating company, but they're certainly at a weakened strategic position. And so some of what the Department of Justice was seeking to block, which is, less options for consumers, higher prices, these are the exact type of things that we'll see if Spirit ends up having more final bankruptcy and needing to actually sell off its assets, or even if it continues to exist in a much weakened strategic position.
As you point out again in your article, who's in the best position to snap up those assets should Spirit be forced to liquidate? It's got to be those bigger, more well-established airlines.
Yes, talk about just giving a gift kind of on a silver platter to the big airlines. And this is often what happens with regulations, when who are the people in place to kind of manipulate regulation, to take advantage of them, to kind of steer from the background. It's always the big players. So that's going to be a problem in any regulation, and especially in antitrust regulation, which is famously so vague and opaque. And it really is kind of the judgment of the people in the room at the time to decide, is this a good idea, and to predict the future, really.
So, Noah, I have to circle back around to something I asked at the very beginning, and that is, How is this benefiting the consumers? Because everything that you've outlined here sounds like it's protecting the airlines, but as far as the actual consumers, which ostensibly that's what the Department of Justice is there to protect, is the consumers, they're the ones kind of left out in the cold.
Yes, I can give the short answer or the long answer. So
Go for the long answer.
is
I'm fine either way.
how do consumers benefit? It's they don't. And then the longer answer is, if we give full benefit of the doubt to the Department of Justice and say, okay, they had the best intentions in mind and they really were trying to help consumers. Okay, we'll take a step back. They can't predict the future, right? They're really just guessing on what will the future hold, what will the business environment be like, what will be better for consumers, and they just purely don't know. They don't have the right incentives in place to be the person benefiting from serving consumers. So what we've seen here is they did not predict the future correctly, and none of us are good at predicting the future. Now, business people have an incentive to try to predict consumer needs, and so that's how businesses are able to actually have some skin in the game when they try to forecast. They're not perfect at it either, but at least they benefit from getting it right and are punished when they get it wrong.
Right. No, and that's, to me, that's one of the best explanations of just basic economics that I've heard. You know, the people who actually have skin in the game have every incentive to do what is in the best interest, not just of their business, but also of the consumer, because it's got to be a win-win for both of them.
Yeah, and if I were to kind of advise future antitrust, kind of conversations, I'm not in those rooms, but if I were, we're seeing this in kind of both administrations, concerns about big business, concerns about antitrust, and so this could continue beyond the Biden administration as well. It's been a hot button, but I expect these conversations will continue. It's really okay, having laser focus on consumer, what benefits the consumer is super important. And then the other thing is having some humility to, okay, yeah, we see where we think things might go, but it's almost always something that we don't predict. It's another market entrant who kind of changes the game. It's another kind of business change in the business environment that no one predicts. So that's really, I think, what this antitrust conversation should refocus on.
Something else you mentioned in your article, Noah, is that mergers and acquisitions are important tools for these businesses. Now, I'm just going with my gut reaction. I'm not an economist, but when I hear those words, merger, acquisition, I've almost been programmed to view those with, that's hostile. You know, some bigger companies bullying or taking over or kicking a smaller company to the curb. Where does that come from? Is that a product of some of this antitrust mentality?
I don't know. I think that some of it is, mergers and acquisitions, there's a lot of people involved. There's a lot of lawyers involved. A ton of people make a lot of money on them. So that's kind of in the popular consciousness of thinking about how mergers and acquisitions work. But when we really need to think about what do they accomplish, and what they can do is take these business assets, these important businesses, and be able to do significant pivots that wouldn't be available to businesses if they just made a change on their own. So it's novel combinations of different sets of assets between two different businesses. It's getting a really great CEO from one business to be able to run a business unit in another. There's all sorts of really, really valuable things. And sometimes it does happen in the background. And there's a lot more money, if we want to talk about waste in these types of things, a lot more money wasted when we have these huge antitrust trials. Lawyers make a lot of money there too as well. But mergers and acquisitions, super important tool, especially at this scale of business, to be able to reorganize, re-strategize, and be able to serve consumers very well.
And again, one of the great points of wisdom that you point out here is decentralized decision-making. That's a hallmark of the free market. And anything that doesn't involve that kind of decentralized decision-making, it's more or less an attempt to control the market. And it, as you have illustrated here, it doesn't always have the desired results.
Absolutely. I don't know how you like to fly. You might not know how I like to fly, but a market allows each of us to kind of have our various preferences borne out in that dynamic exchange.
Again, we are talking with Noah Gould. He is a Young Voices contributor. Talk to us for a moment, Noah, about where people can follow your work, especially where they might find you on social media.
Yeah, so on X, you can find me at Noah C. Gould 1, and you can find updates on all my writing there. So, Brian, thanks a lot, and look forward to talking again.
And we are back. This is Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Jeffrey E. Schulman back to the program. Jeffrey, good to see you once again. And for those meeting you for the first time, take just a second to tell us a little bit about your background.
So I'm sort of a PhD student, do history, but I've been living in Europe about 4 or 5 years, and it was there that I sort of got interested in the aviation industry and also sort of following what that means initially over there in Europe, but now back home in the United States. And that sort of brought me to write this article. I think about something what you just heard about, of sort of like what's going on with the Biden administration blocking this merger for Spirit and so forth.
This is a really great follow-up. I'm so happy that your segment follows one where we've kind of laid a little bit of the groundwork here, but you mentioned living in Europe and traveling back and forth. My wife and I have kids who live in Europe, and so when we shop for airline tickets, there's a balance that we're looking. We're not just looking for the quickest way. We're looking for what's affordable but comfortable and so forth. And it's really nice to have that choice. Now, taking it into the broader picture, Spirit Airlines is filing for bankruptcy. Talk to me about your take on what has happened there, as well as what should have happened instead of them basically not being able to merge with who was it? Was it JetBlue that was looking at them?
Well, yeah, there were a couple suitors. You had both, and so there's a little bit of, the two knights competing for the maiden story, where you had both Frontier and then JetBlue sort of swooped in, and then all of that got called off. And what's so interesting, I just thought, is you sort of had a very interesting point in your previous conversation. We're sort of saying, okay, consolidation, mergers. Why does that sound so bad? And that, I think, really gets to a little bit of the root of what's happening here, which is that a lot of people who are afraid of mergers, for example, are afraid of there being fewer entrants. And what's supposed to happen is you don't lose competitors because, new airlines are going to come join the market. They're going to be constantly bubbling up from below, just as the ones at the top are sort of joining together again and again. And so you sort of have a repeating process. And that's not happening in the United States right now. And that's why what the Biden administration is doing, you've got like all this water coming over the dam, and the administration has sort of been trying to like plug a hole with its thumb, right? It's not going to work so long as you have these conditions in the industry sort of related to overregulation.
Wow. Let's talk about what this means for people who just simply want to enjoy the best, what best fits their needs in terms of air travel. Now, we talked in the last segment about how the four major airlines tend to benefit. I have to ask, are their lobbyists the ones who are calling the shots here, or is there something more that would explain the Biden administration's intervention in this proposed merger for Spirit Airlines?
You're right. Like, I think a little bit of it is right political, right? The sort of Biden administration has been sort of very skeptical of this corporate consolidation, but there are also a group of people who are naturally inclined to favor regulation. And so maybe at the political level, they're just sort of prone to look at it this way, but also not really to ask the big questions about what's going on. What are the underlying details? And because of this, it seems like for them, right, like the more they try and stop this happening, in fact, the more it goes on because they're taking exactly the wrong approach.
Now, you mentioned something in your article about, I think you used John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York as an example of part of the problem. What does it mean to be a slot-controlled airport? And for instance, what does that mean to smaller airlines who would like to utilize those kinds of airports?
Yeah, and so and I gave New York JFK Airport as an example. It's not all that typical that airports are slot controlled, but Kennedy is. And what that means is that there's a limited number of takeoffs and landings, right? Only a certain number of planes can land per hour, a certain number take off. And different airlines control the rights to take off and land, right? So if you have the right to land your planes there, and you own those slots, then another airline doesn't. And because of this, right, as long as there's a lack of slots and a lack of capacity, right? It's really just going to be a battle for who has these limited access rights. And that's really going to favor the big incumbent players.
Okay, that makes sense. And, I know that there has to be some kind of good intention at the basis of this. For the most part, I think, antitrust legislation originates out of the idea, look, we're just trying to look out for the consumer. But it seems like it comes at the cost of competition, which in the end seems to harm the consumer.
Yes, and I think the key that people just miss, right, is that this is a super regulated industry, right? So like typical story, it used to be if you wanted to fly, a long way over the oceans, you had to have four engines. And then about the beginning of the 90s, late 80s, they changed the rules to say, okay, if your engines are reliable enough, and engines were getting better. So there was some reason for this regulatory change, but they said, okay, if you have the new engines, then you can just fly with two engines. And because in most cases the big four engine jets were just less economical, they quickly disappeared. But that only happened, right, because of the rule change that allowed it. And so, right, like if you look at this industry, for example, there are rules on the number of pilots you have to have, how long they have to rest, the number of flight attendants per passenger, etc. And so because of that, those are some of the things that really are going to have, right, an effect on the prices and also an effect on the airline's ability to sort of do things differently and offer a different kind of product, maybe the sort of product you'd like, right?
Hey, something else you pointed out in your article, too, and I had heard this, but I'd forgotten that federal law requires pilots to retire at age 65. And look,
Yep.
I'm getting closer to 65 than I ever thought I would, so that doesn't really seem that old. What is the downside of a mandatory retirement age like that when by that point you're dealing with very highly experienced air crews? Is it a bad idea to force them to retire at that age?
Yeah, and so I think you run into two problems where, now the current regulation just isn't very modern, right? On the one hand, just our society is getting older, we're all going to have to think about doing things for, a little longer, pilots too. But on the other hand, right, I think we're also getting a lot smarter about sort of measuring cognitive ability, measuring reaction time, right? There's been like a lot of research into sort of biological age versus literal age, and sort of saying, okay, actually, maybe you have the body of a 40-year-old, but you've lived for 50 years, or vice versa. So you can also now actually like look at people's fitness and say, okay, you know what, even though you're 65, you're still performing well or you're not. And so you could take a smarter approach to it. And that would also help sort of stem the shortage of pilots that we were particularly having, a year or two ago, right? If we were just to get smarter about that. But so far, Congress just has not been able to do anything to sort of move to a new system.
Now, you do a wonderful job of identifying the problems here. You also offer, I think, a very workable solution. Talk to me about how Congress could fix this problem.
And I mean, I think what you'd really like to do, right? And we already had this where a lot of people don't remember back in the 70s, 80s, flying was super expensive. Ordinary people couldn't afford it until Congress deregulated the industry. They didn't try to set the prices, set the routes, and suddenly there's a lot more competition. And so I think just doing sort of another bill that incorporates a lot of these small changes, that sort of deregulates the industry in a smart but still safe way, would be something that would do a lot more than just the sort of antitrust enforcement to help preserve affordable air travel.
Nice. I mean, I admire anybody who can point out the problem clearly, but I really appreciate those who can also put forth the solution and say, and here's how you could overcome this in the first place. Again, we are talking with Jeffrey E. Schulman. He is a Young Voices contributor. Jeffrey, tell us where people can follow your work and where we can find you on social media.
Yep, totally. So I think a good place is my Muckrack page. That's muckrack.com/Jeffrey E. Schulman. That's JEFFREY-E-SCHULMAN. And I'm, putting all my stories up there. Great to talk to you.
Great to visit with you. Thank you. Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Hey, we're happy to welcome Garion Frankel back to the program. Gary, we have you on here on a regular basis, but I'm convinced there are still people meeting you for the first time. So take a moment, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yes, certainly, and thanks for having me back. I'm currently a doctoral researcher in PK-12 educational leadership at Texas A&M University. I frequently write about and research education policy, the history of education, the history of the United States, and where those topics sort of come together in order to instruct us about our problems nowadays.
I'm looking at an opinion piece you wrote, and actually was published last summer, why Texas should ban cell phones in schools. And first of all, I've got to tell you, you're poking the bear, my friend. At least I say that because I have a 16-year-old daughter who I'm sure would consider that absolutely outrageous. But I would love to get your thinking on this, because I'm convinced cell phones in schools is really not a great thing. I'm just not sure how to portray it in such a way that doesn't provoke a mutiny.
Yeah, that's a good point. We introduced technology in the classroom, widespread phone usage, that sort of thing, about 15 years ago as a really interesting experiment to see if sort of integrating our personal devices into an educational environment could help make the learning experience not only better for students and teachers alike, but also more effective and more fun. And we're starting to finally get some of the first really good long-term studies now after the first 10 or 15 years, and the results are not good. From everything that I've seen, phones in schools have made education demonstrably worse in pretty much every meaningful way.
So let's talk about some of the specifics. Obviously, you put a kid, I'm sorry, I'm generalizing, adults do this too, but especially with kids, you put them in the room with a screen, especially where they have access to that screen, and it's like magic. It's magnetic. It's like they can't look away from it.
It is magnetic, and it's especially magnetic when the teacher is lecturing about something that they're not particularly interested in, even if they really want to know it, and they really need to know it, not only for success at the high school level, but just going forward into their adult lives. A lot of this stuff is really important, but it's not necessarily interesting to your average 16 or 17-year-old kid. So the phone is a very easy distraction. But what we've noticed, and one study that I mentioned in my article really gets into this, is that if a student is using their phone in the classroom for 5 hours a day, which a lot of students do, compared to students who use their phones for maybe 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, big difference, right? But you have a lot of students in each category. The students who use their phones more often do more damage to their own learning than the COVID-19 pandemic did.
Wow.
It's just this huge negative effect. And, when we let our kids use phones in schools for hours and hours a day, or don't enforce the rules that are already there, we're pretty much creating new individual COVID-19 pandemics in every single kid in this country. And that's not sustainable. The education system can't handle that. The workforce can't handle that. Virtue itself can't handle that. And we just need to get it under control in a more effective way.
Given how ubiquitous cell phones are, how realistic is it to get kids to give them up? I mean, short of, collecting them at the door like they were going into a courthouse, how else could it be done?
Well, to a certain extent, and a lot of schools are doing that. They are collecting phones when kids come into class each day. There are some districts that are investing into these little pouches that magnetically lock students' phones outside of very certain times and very certain instances. Some just don't even let them into the building. Some require students to keep them in their lockers or in their backpacks away from their possession. And if they're caught with them, there are some serious consequences. Some teachers simply make students put their phones in a pouch at the front of the classroom. That's not as ideal because they can still look at them and still think about their phone, but it's better than nothing. There are ways that schools can do this in order to create a more useful learning environment, and they don't necessarily have to cost $10 zillion. Okay,
I'm open to hearing some of those ways. Now, I'm also going to ask you, What are the arguments being made in favor of, no, let the kids keep them? I'm sure there's a convenience argument, but what are the more common excuses that are given for why the kids need to have those cell phones in hand even when they're sitting in class?
There are two arguments that I generally hear most often. The first is that if an emergency happens at school, if there's something serious, like God forbid a school shooting or something like that, then it's good for the students to have their phones on them so they can all call emergency services. But what law enforcement officials actually say is that they prefer for that not to happen, because if they're getting their information from teachers, from administrators, from a school resource officer, rather than dozens of panicked students, it's a lot easier for them to figure out exactly what's going on and what they need to do in order to end the threat. The second objection I hear is that given some of the nonsense that's happened in schools over the past 5 or 10 years, that it gives kids an essential way to document what's happening in classrooms. And I hear that argument, but is it worth all of the negative repercussions that we're seeing from widespread phone use in the classroom? We have to talk about trade-offs there. And I personally don't think that that benefit is worth the learning cost that we're seeing in schools across the country. And, if a school gives out Chromebooks or something like that, which a lot of them do, you can still record or document stuff. So it's not even an entire lost cause in that department. But those are the arguments I hear most often.
Okay. And actually, I'm thinking, as a parent, those actually sound like some of the arguments I would at least consider. When my child is sick and can call me and say, Dad, I feel like I'm going to throw up. Could you please call the front desk and have them check me out? That's pretty convenient. But I'm playing up the advantage there compared to, is she texting her friends, and is she, when I send her a cute, meme or something and she's liking it, that's during class time, and I should probably be taking some pretty deep concern that, wait a minute, what am I distracting her from?
Yeah, we've gotten pretty spoiled pretty quickly when it comes to convenience. And when you think about it, we survived perfectly well with the public education system, largely as it is, for 30 to 40 years before the real technology started coming in. And so I don't think personally that it's an unrealistic ask for you to use the little phones in every single classroom, or going to the office if you feel sick or you need to check out a school for some reason. There are ways to get around this. They may not be as convenient as what we're used to at this point, but I think the learning loss that we're seeing, the behavioral issues, just everything under the sun, is too much to bear.
Are there other states that Texas can look to for examples of how this can be done and in a workable way?
Well, you're starting to see a real movement here. There are a couple of proposals for a statewide ban starting to pop up around the country. But really what I think is more useful is to look at what individual districts have done. And there are districts in all sorts of environments, all around Texas and other places around the country, that have come up with pretty creative ways to limit the amount of phone usage in room, even just requiring them to keep their phones in their lockers. They can't even be seen with them. That is a zero-cost way to implement this sort of policy. It still lets them have access to their devices in an emergency, and you'll see some of the benefits in the classroom of restoring their attention span, limiting distractions.
All right. There are no easy answers, but what you're describing sounds like a solution that actually would work. Even if it's not easy, it still sounds like the most workable.
Got to do something here. There's just been too much damage.
All right. For people who want to get better informed on this, whether it's through your writing or if there's other sources that you've come to regard on this, what do you recommend they go to get their minds around it, maybe make some decisions on how to regulate their own kids' use?
Well, a lot of the state-level think tanks in the state policy network world are doing some really good research on this. Daniel Buck is another person to really look into. And as far as my work, I'm most reachable on Twitter or X or whatever it's called now at FrankelGarion.
Again, we're talking with Garion Frankel. Gary, wonderful to visit with you again. Happy New Year.
To you as well. Thanks for having me.
And we are back. This is Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Samantha Dagres back to the program. And I got to give you a special commendation here, Samantha. You're working through jet lag, but thank you so much for being here to talk to us. For those who don't know you well, could you just take a moment to tell us a little bit about your background?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. Happy to be back despite the jet lag. I work at a public policy think tank based in Canada called the Montreal Economic Institute, and I am their communications manager.
All right. Well, Canada's been in the news headlines here for a couple of reasons here lately. I first have to ask you, I see where Prime Minister Trudeau has stepped down, and I just want to ask, does this indicate that there's a shift coming in the way that the Canadian government will be going? Does this portend a shift in direction?
Yeah, I think that we have been seeing the shift mainly in the upward trajectory of the Conservative Party in their popularity. Pierre Poilievre has been doing spectacularly in the polls. We've seen them, they're about 20 points above the Liberals. And so this is really just kind of the bookend of this. Young people, Canadians in general, are very unhappy with the status quo. There's a lack of housing, a lack of healthcare, a lack of economic opportunity. And I think this is we could discuss whether the timing was right, but definitely I think basically a foregone conclusion for Canadians.
I think the last time you and I spoke, we were talking about tax competitiveness or talking about taxation. Talk to me about how declining tax competitiveness is failing Canada's young people. That's the name of an opinion piece that you've penned for the financialpost.com. First of all, when we talk about tax competitiveness, can you kind of help me understand, what does that mean?
Absolutely. So a U.S.-based firm called the Tax Foundation comes out with an annual index, the Tax Competitiveness Index, and it basically ranks tax competitiveness. So this takes in kind of two things: whether a tax jurisdiction is competitive in the sense that our tax is lower, our tax is manageable, or is the tax code simple for people to navigate. And it also takes into account neutrality. So is the government being very paternalistic in the tax code? Is it going after certain industries, certain types of businesses? And so it ranks basically all of the 38 OECD countries. And what we found this year was that Canada dropped by two positions. So we were 15th last year, and now we're 17th. And this is mostly chalked up to the fact that the federal government announced that they were going to increase the capital gains inclusion rate from 50% to 66.7%.
So that has a tendency to punish people who are willing to be risk takers, entrepreneurs, people who are willing to get out there and achieve. It sounds like that's a powerful incentive. Hey, don't do that unless you want to surrender a significant chunk of that to the government.
Absolutely. You're not mitigating the risk of starting a business, of investing in a startup, right? 90% of startups fail. So the government is saying that, yeah, you know what, the risk of starting something new is going to stay the same, but the reward is actually going to diminish, and it's going to come to federal government coffers. Wow.
That's very blunt, but I don't think there's a more accurate way that you could say it. With the shift in the leadership of Canada's government, is it likely that you will see more tax competitiveness versus less?
I think that Pierre Poilievre has signaled a willingness to be more business friendly. He's been a bit scant on the details of what this would look like in regards to whether he would lower corporate taxes. On the subject of capital gains, whether or not it will go forward is actually a bit uncertain right now, because in Canada, when Parliament prorogues, that means all bills that are being reviewed or about to pass basically die. And so the capital gains tax legislation hasn't passed yet. However, the Canadian Revenue Agency, which is our tax agency, has said that they will move forward. People are saying that it's kind of unconstitutional since it hasn't passed in Parliament. So there's a lot of uncertainty about it. But I mean, if it does fail, if it falls because of the pro-government, Pierre Poilievre doesn't even have to take the political capital to go back on what the Liberals have done. He's talked about axing the carbon tax. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar. I think you guys might have a form of carbon tax, a consumer-based carbon tax So he's talking about scrapping that, which will be good for consumers, good for businesses. But most provinces ultimately have their own form of carbon pricing. So for half of the country, that won't make a huge difference. So he has been rhetorically very pro-business. We'll have to see if that really is true in his policy proposals.
You mentioned in your article that particularly younger Canadians are the ones who are really feeling the pinch here. Does this shift in government? I know it's early; it's only been a day or two, but does it give them a sense that maybe some opportunities are opening up for them in terms of a lighter or a smaller governmental footprint?
Well, that's certainly what Pierre Poilievre has signaled are his intent. And a lot of his popularity has been riding on the youth vote. He mentioned this in all of his interviews, that he sees a large number of his rallies are comprised of young people. It probably has to do with excitement about him, but also just dismay with the current status quo. But when you have a tax system that is so punishing, that is so hostile to starting your own business, you're telling young people that, just stop, don't even start, right? It is such a grueling exercise to start your own business, to follow your own dreams, as cheesy as that sounds. And if you have a government that's telling you that, even if you do make it, we're going to keep most of it, it doesn't create a very hopeful political environment for young people.
I was very surprised to read in your article, when you mentioned Scandinavian countries, for instance, I would think of, they're very high taxing and, very, very leaning towards socialism. But you point out in some ways they score far better than Canada does in terms of tax competitiveness. And I guess because I'm not Canadian, I don't feel the pinch of those. I feel the pinch of the taxes in the U.S., but I never would have associated Canada with being less competitive taxation-wise than places like Sweden, Norway, or Finland.
Well, Canada has this tendency to just kind of add to the tax code without going back and simplifying it. Because I was also quite surprised to see that we're less competitive than the Scandinavian countries. And the folks at the Tax Foundation said that it has to do with simplicity. The tax codes in those countries are just easier to navigate than in Canada. We haven't had reforms in such a long time. And as we know, regulation is the cost of doing business. For small businesses, maybe they can't hire attorneys and accountants to wade through all of our complex legal tax system, whereas big businesses can. So that's just another reason why it's harder to get ahead in Canada. And
it was also interesting to read that, as far as happiness among their young people under 30, those nations actually rank very high as well.
Absolutely. And like I said at the beginning, it has to do with a lot of things, just cultural and social cohesion. We don't have that in Canada. We don't have housing. We don't have healthcare. And now we're losing out on economic opportunities, which will possibly get worse. We're about to have no government during a Trump inauguration. And for 2 months of Trump's first 2 months of being president again, we will have no federal government, no House of Commons, I should say. So I think people are just kind of, they're not very hopeful about the future. Hopefully Pierre Poilievre comes through on what he's proposing. But I think, it's just an amalgamation of things that are making it just difficult for Canadians to see a very bright future for themselves.
We've got just under a minute, but where can they begin to reverse these tax policies and start going in the right direction?
It's simple. You just have to reduce the tax burden on individuals and businesses. Canada's corporate tax rate is 3 points above the OECD average, which means half of the OECD is more attractive for businesses to start and for capital to flow into, right? In a global market, small shifts in tax differences make a huge difference in terms of where people are going to decide to put their money in. And we need to make sure that we are staying competitive. But right now we're finding ourselves on the opposite end of the competitive spectrum.
All right. Again, we are talking with Samantha Dagres. She's a Young Voices contributor. And I wish you all the very best. I want to see a bright future for all those young entrepreneurs in Canada as well. Where can people follow you on social media? Where can they find your writing?
You can find me on Twitter at Sam_Dagres. And if you would like to find our work at the Montreal Economic Institute, you can go to iedm.org.